G'day, welcome to the Feral Garden. I'm Conrad and today we're going to look at wicking beds, what they are and why you should put one in your garden. So let's get going. So what is a wicking bed? Well, a wicking bed is a garden bed with a reservoir of water down the bottom. That water wicks up through capillary action through the soil and feeds the plants. The reason I decided to use wicking beds is my old traditional garden beds were very labour intensive. The soil around here is very sandy and it's hydrophobic. In other words, the water repels off the top of the sand and it takes a lot of organic matter and a lot of watering to be able to get a garden to flourish. Year after year I also had competition from other plant roots coming up underneath. It was so bad I actually had to put weed mat down to try to stop those garden beds from being robbed of all the water that I was putting into them. So what I decided to do is I wanted to look at a solution to those problems, and wicking beds were the answer. What I decided to do after much investigation was build basically the same sort of garden beds, but raise them, line them, and then have a reservoir of water down the bottom. So what I want to do now is take you through how I put together the two main garden beds in the Feral Garden. Okay, we'll do a little walkthrough of the garden beds, how I put them together. They're the same size as the existing garden beds I had. They're 2.4 metres long by 1.2 metres across. Rather than being down, flat and low, I raised them up 3 sleepers high, which is 200mm each sleeper, 600mm or 2 foot. Makes it a good height to get at and get at the garden. It also gives me 200mm down the bottom for the water and 300mm of soil, which is the optimum for the soil. Prefers to wick up about 300mm, not much more than that. I held them together with big coach screws. I made each one separately. Put the coach screws in and then put them all on top of each other. To hold them together I used some of the old material I had in my old garden beds, my old sleepers. I put them on the outside. I've seen them on the inside, but I think they take up space and get in the way of the liner. So once the garden bed is built, you need to put a liner in. Now the liner I used was a pond liner, but you can use black plastic if you wish. Get the heavy duty black builder's plastic and that will do the same job. Once it's lined, you put in a drain. I put in some slotted pipe down the bottom and then blue metal. And if you want to fill up, you have an access pipe and you can see the water down the bottom. A little cap on the top prevents mozzies getting in and also any debris, and that's how I can fill it up. I then put in some geotextile fabric. That's this white fabric you can see over here. That keeps the soil in and stops it from combining with the blue metal in the water layer. And then I put in a soil mix. The soil mix was basically the original soil I had in my garden beds, very sandy, as much compost as I could put in, but I also added some more compost, manure, and it makes quite a rich soil mix. If you look at that, you can see how moist it is underneath the mulch layer, and that's why the tomatoes love it so much. My little friend the wriggly worms are in there as well, and they love the garden beds as well. I suggest you mulch once your plants reach a certain height, and that also prevents evaporation. You can't just leave the garden beds like that. You have to have an outlet valve so that the water doesn't get too high. Basically I want the water to continue on around about that 200mm height. So you put in one of these little valves. It has to be siliconed in and they get cut off right at the height that you want the water to be at. The water then can overflow out of that pipe if it rains or you put too much water in. That way the soil doesn't start to rot inside the garden bed. As you can see, the garden beds are doing really well. Got plenty of fruit and veg at the moment in summer. Chilies, capsicum, cucumber, the stars at the moment are the tomatoes. Lots of people as they pass by comment about the tomatoes, how they've gone feral, and that's one of the reasons we call it the feral garden. I think the wicking beds certainly help to keep it nice and feral. Also have a nice lot of tomatoes on this side, going really well this summer. We'll see how far they go. I've actually put some strings up there, and we're going to run them across the top when they get to be too big. But that's why I like the wicking beds. They pretty well look after themselves. I can go away now for a week or 2 weeks and know that I don't need to even worry about having the beds watered. They'll water themselves. They look after themselves, which is exactly what I want. Another wicking bed we have in the feral garden are these two made out of IBCs. This was a segment on the Gardening Australia show. It was by Sophie, who was down in South Australia, and she put together these particular beds. You need one IBC, which stands for Intermediate Bulk Container. They're fairly common. If you go to Gumtree, you'll find plenty of them in your area. I would suggest you use a food grade one that's had something fairly safe in it before you put a garden through it. It's a matter of cutting it in half, and you use one side as your base and the other side flip over. And these particular gardens, again, you don't need a liner, which is the big bonus, but you do put your little overflow fittings in, and they're just a matter of siliconing those in. Just zoom in on that particular one over here. Again, they can be turned so that if you have any water you don't want in there, you can get rid of it. These ones have zucchinis in them, which have been absolutely going crazy. I always suggest you mulch your garden. And if you dig down, as I said, you can see how moist the soil is. It stays that way through the hottest. And again, our wormies, there's our little worms. They love it in the soil as well. I'll need to top these ones up in a minute. I'll put a link in the description to the Gardening Australia video of how Sophie put these together. But from one IBC you get two garden beds, and they fit very well into the garden. And if you didn't want to build one out of timber, they are a great option. Now we're over in the side garden, we'll look at some other ideas in wicking beds as well. They don't have to be big garden beds, they can actually be quite small. Over here, I'll just pick up the camera, we have some wicking barrels. These particular barrels over here, I'm just trialling to see how well they go. All they are 20 litre food grade containers. There are actually two of them together. And what they do is they have soil in the top. This one's a blueberry, this one has a tomato in it. And if I just pull the handle apart, I'll show you how the wicking action takes place. One bucket fits inside the other. You can see the water reserve down the bottom. And that water then wicks up through the soil and feeds the plants. You don't need to use timber. I've also made a wicking barrel out of an existing garden bed. These are fairly common raised garden beds. This one actually used to belong to my dad. And in this particular garden bed, I've changed it to a wicking bed. Again, I've added the overflow pipe. It's fully lined, and this one is just for herbs. In this particular one, this garden bed never used to produce very much, but now that it's a wicking bed, people can come by, pick the herbs. We use them for our garden, of course. So you can use your imagination and make a garden bed out of just about anything. So what are the advantages of wicking beds? The most important advantage is they use less water. As gardeners, we know water is our most precious resource, and if you can have a garden bed that uses less, it's a win-win situation. Your garden also doesn't need daily watering. Once the plants are established, you can go away for 1, possibly 2 weeks, depending on the season, and you'll know your plants are getting regular water, and when you come back, you just top up your wicking beds. Some plants, as you can see, love them, particularly tomatoes, but a lot of others as well. Eggplants, chilies, they really thrive on them, especially during the summer months. It also stops any root competition. Because you've got that liner of water, you're stopping the roots getting underneath and into your garden bed and stealing that precious water of yours. It also uses less fertiliser. Because the water down the bottom is capturing that fertiliser, it's not leaching into the soil. You don't need as much, and you can be pretty well assured that your plants are going to have plenty of fertiliser or plenty of nutrients to grow. What are the disadvantages? Well, there have got to be some. Probably the most important, or probably the biggest disadvantage, is the cost. Garden beds like these, they cost about $400 to put together. So they're not cheap. But that cost is over many years, and I think it's worth it. You also need to have some skills if you're going to build your own. If you've got some physical, or you're a handy person, being able to build your own garden beds is not that hard. If, however, you're interested in wicking beds, there are plenty of companies that will build them for you as well. So to finish up, let's look at where I got the ideas to put these wicking beds into action. The very first one I got was an Australian site called wickingbeds.com.au. It's by a company called Veg, which stands for Very Edible Gardens. Now they have a conversion kit. You can change an existing garden bed into a wicking bed. But the best part is they actually show you step by step how to put together your wicking bed from the components. Now you can choose to buy their kit or you can source the materials yourself. But check out the videos, they are excellent. Another good site is Rob's Aquaponics and Backyard Farm. It is a YouTube channel, and on there he has lots of wicking barrels and gardens, and he's been doing wicking beds for a long time. Check out some of his thoughts and ideas as well. Now the wicking barrels I showed you came from a website called The Urban Gardener. Now on that YouTube channel he takes you through step by step how to make those two barrels together into a wicking barrel. It's really quite simple. You can make them very quickly if you've got some skills and basic tools. So I hope I've shown you that wicking beds are something you should be thinking about in your garden. So join me next time on The Feral Garden. I'll see you then.